Hi everyone, welcome to today's Textile Talk. Today we have Quilts and Health presented by the Modern Quilt Guild. I know many of you are still arriving. But before we begin, thank you so much for joining us. I am Brenna, the Communications Manager of the MQG, and today I'm joined by Marsha MacDowell, Beth Donaldson, and Clare Luz. Before we start our presentation, I want to get some of the housekeeping out of the way first. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, please send us a note in the Q&A box, and we will chat with you to find a solution. You can always close Zoom and log back in. We'll still be here. We'll still be talking about quilts and health. And if you miss any part while you're logging off and logging back on, this presentation is being recorded. It will be added to the MQG resource page and to SAQA's YouTube channel and their website. So with that, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the discussion, about 10 minutes at the end. So if you have questions, please do put those in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So when using the chat and the Q&A, we respectfully ask you to be courteous as you engage with the speakers, moderators, and other participants. Please use the Q&A for questions, the chat box for greeting others, and survey commentary, ways we can improve. That would all go in the chat box. If you prefer not to see any notifications from the chat, you can click on the button, on the chat button, to toggle them on or off. Okay, so Textile Talks. If you are new to Textile Talks, welcome. And if you've been to many before, welcome back. This is a free series of weekly presentations and panel discussions from fiber art organizations. And those organizations include the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Surface Design Associates, Surface Design Association, and Studio Art Quilters Associates, and us at the Modern Quilt Guild. We'd not be able to do textiles without our sponsors, so we want to thank you to our sponsors. We are sponsored by Aurifil, Artistic Artifacts, C&T Publishing, Empty Spool Seminars, eQuilter.com, Handy Quilter, Misty Fuse, Moda Fabrics and Supplies, 9 Patch Fabrics, Quiltmania, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. So that's all about Textile Talks and our platform of Zoom. Now I can introduce my speakers today. We have Marsha, Beth, and Clare. So a little bit about each of them. Marsha MacDowell is a Ph.D. She is a professor and curator of folk arts and quilt studies at Michigan State University Museum. She is the director of the Quilt Index, and she has authored numerous publications on quilt history. Beth Donaldson has been a quilt maker for over 40 years. She has authored 4 publications on quilting, and she is the associate director of the Quilt Index. Finally, we have Clare Luz. She is an associate professor in the College of Osteopathic Medicine at Michigan State University, and she is the director of both AgeAlive and IMPART Alliance. Her research has focused on the direct care workforce and the intersection of arts, aging, and well-being. So with that, I will hand things over to Marsha, and I will pop back in for the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all for coming today and allowing us to share our stories and our images. We actually have a method to our madness here in terms of 3 of us presenting. I'll be the kickoff person, and then I'll throw it back to Clare, who will throw it back to me for a moment in time, and then we'll turn it over to Beth, and then finally we'll be happily entertaining Q&A. So with that, I'll just jump right in. And I'm going to be reading some text to begin with that is drawn from the book Quilts and Health that the 3 of us co-authored in 2018 that was produced by Indiana University Press. So here I go. Quilts substantially contribute to health and well-being. The number of health-related quilts made is in the millions. Name an illness, medical condition, or disease, and you will find quilt making associated with it. From Alzheimer's to irritable bowel syndrome, associated quilts have been made by thousands of individuals to support personal well-being, health education, patient advocacy, memorialization of victims, and or fundraising. There is also a long history of individuals and groups making quilts in response to the physical and emotional needs of those who are facing disasters or difficult times. Certainly, that's happening right now during this pandemic. When illness or disaster strikes, quilts can play a key role in both individual and public healing. Some health-related quilts are the singular expression of one person's experience with illness or coping with adversity. And for some diseases or disasters, there are literally tens of thousands of quilts that have been and are being made. Increasingly, quilts are being made and used in healthcare contexts. They are used to help create welcoming, comforting, and healing environments in hospitals and other caregiving settings. They are used to provide dignity for those who are undergoing care and to provide hands-on activities that help patients positively cope with their institutional care. Recent research shows that making and using quilts has measurable impact on strengthening cognitive abilities and mitigating emotional health issues. The stories behind these quilts are often moving and speak strongly to the healing power of quilts and quilt making. Individuals tell about making and using quilts to cope with and recover from major illness, grief, and traumatic events. And many references are given to quilts being used as textile hugs. We've heard this over and over again. They enfold the user in warmth and comfort. Whether or not they know the maker of the quilt, the recipient knows that another person, another human being, not a machine, has made that quilt and knows that another individual in the world cares about them. Most of the stories are simply shared person to person, yet increasingly they're being recorded and shared through many documentation projects. But it is through these stories that the meaning and messages of the quilt or quilts is more completely understood, and the deep connections between the textile and health become evident. So I'm going to begin now with sharing a very personal story, and one where quilts and health coincide, and which was the impetus for this deep examination of quilts and health that Claire and Beth and I embarked on. And so Claire, I'll need that first slide. So in August 2009, my sister Claire, full disclosure, she is my sister, was asked by a colleague to organize a public panel on arts and healing in conjunction with Art Prize in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Since Claire had long been interested in that intersection of arts and health and medicine, she agreed to do a presentation. And then she turned to me, of course she would, as my sister, to see if I could do something, knowing of my quote research. I said, off the top of my head, I knew I had data on the AIDS quilt, and I certainly knew of a number of other quilts related to health, but I said tentatively yes, but let me check my files. So I'll get back to you in the morning, Claire. That night, I looked through several physical and digital files I maintain, and I was astounded at the breadth and the depth of what I had already amassed on the topic. And I emailed her with a most definite yes. That night, I realized that the topic of quilts and health was an area of quilt studies that was woefully under-researched. A few days before our scheduled presentation, Claire and I sat in a hospital room with our mother, Betty MacDowell, an art historian, who was recovering from hip replacement surgery. Partly out of curiosity and partly as a means to pass the time, we asked nearly every medical professional who came into the room to try and stump us, to give us one disease or illness they think could not be connected to quilts. And then they exited the room and we busily Googled, thank God the room was wireless. And we, when the medical professional returned, we said, aha, we not only have one quilt connected to that condition, we have perhaps tens of thousands. So we then realized we needed to investigate this more. And we brought in our colleague Beth, and together we began to create Google searches for Quilts and Health. We initiated a Quilts and Health blog and Facebook page. We sent out calls through listservs and social media for stories about health-related quilts. And we scoured interviews on Quilters Save Our Stories. We created a Mendeley site to collect articles. And then we established a section of the Quilt Index, which Beth will be showing you later, to allow for easier searching of health connections to the over 80,000 images and stories in that massive digital resource. So, okay, we're getting interested in the topic, but then suddenly in January 2012, the topic of quilts and health took an unexpected personal turn. A regular mammogram I took detected some abnormalities, and I was scheduled for a biopsy. I walked into the waiting room of the Breast Cancer Center in Lansing, Michigan, where a quilted wall hanging of a set of 6 bras was the only adornment in the waiting area, which was actually rather bleak, except for that quilt. Well, I tested positive for breast cancer and subsequently had a lumpectomy, followed by 6 weeks of radiation and 2 doses of chemotherapy. And in one of the hallways of the Sparrow Hospital in Lansing, where I had my surgery, hung one quilt. I started encountering them everywhere. At the clinic where I underwent daily radiation treatments, at least on 2 occasions, there was a basket filled with textile materials, sometimes like a quilted hot pad or something else that was handmade that could be distributed to anybody who came into the clinic that day. But next slide, Claire. Can you advance?
Yeah, it's just going a little slow.
Okay, so it was, though, at my first treatment of chemotherapy that the emotional and physical comfort of quilts to those who were coping with illness came most powerfully into my life. In the austere and rather chilly room, I was surrounded by other patients, some of whom had lost their hair, most had companions with them. Alone, I was hooked up to the intravenous chemo drip, and almost immediately the head nurse appeared before me with 2 large shopping bags. And she said to me, "Oh, you're a new patient. You can choose one of these bags." And I was astounded. I was surprised. I was joyful when I realized that what she was offering me was one of 2 quilts. And throughout my diagnosis and the surgery and the recovery period, I had not cried. But at that point, the floodgates let loose. And I said to her, "Do you know what my research is? And could you take a picture of me?" And that's the picture Claire's trying to get to. And so she snapped a picture for me. And then I read the letter that was accompanying the quilt. It was from Bobby Slider of Lansing, Michigan, who had been quietly making quilts for all of the new patients who came into that center. because she had accompanied a friend to that very same place and realized how cold it was in terms of being a sterile environment and physically cold. And she just set out to make quilts for everyone who came in there. So I quickly contacted her, and I found out that as of that moment, she had already made 400 quilts for each new patient. So now I do see quilts everywhere I go as I continue my journey of health. And I am still amazed at how many quilts we still find that are connected with quilts. And until she unexpectedly passed away in 2012 of pancreatic cancer, and even through her own research, and though her own research was focused on stained glass and women's history, Betty MacDowell, our mother, continued to help find references to Quilts and Health. So I'll just break now from my own personal story to say that what you will see is a smattering of quilts and their stories. And now I will turn it over to Claire to show those images and share those stories.
Thank you, Marsha. And thank you to the Modern Quilt Guild for inviting us to present our work, and to all of you who are on the line. I'm just amazed at people coming in from all over the world. It's wonderful. And apologies about the slides not advancing very rapidly. We do have a plan B, just in case this continues. Beth will be able to pull up the same PowerPoint and do it from her computer, so have no fear. As Marsha said, I am going to show a number of images of quilts and tell you their associated stories. We had so much rich material to work with. It was just really hard to decide what to include in the book, and then to pare it down into just a few images for today was very difficult as well. But I hope this is representative of some of the themes that emerged from our research. The first set of slides are of individual quilts made by individual artists, starting with this one. And you might say, what is so health related about this one? The majority of health related quilts have no visual reference to health. For many artists, making the quilt is in itself the therapy, whether it's to keep their minds off of pain and worry, or to keep them focused on activities that support their own sense of well-being, or compassion for making sure others have well-being. The design of the quilt is actually incidental to the activity, and you have to know the story behind it to know the connection to health. And the story behind this quilt here which is called Lemoyne Star, was told by William Brickley about his great-grandmother, Rebecca Brickley, when he donated her quilt to the MSU Museum. And he explained that in 1865, Rebecca discovered that she had breast cancer, and she told her family, "You all want to go to Michigan, so we're going to go now. We're going to go this year so that I won't be left behind." So in the fall of 1865, they harvested their crops, sold their farm in New York, and started for Michigan with all of their possessions in a wagon and the cows tied behind the wagon. And they traveled all winter long, and they reached Ionia, Michigan in the spring of 1866. And Rebecca made this quilt on that journey while she was dying. She made it for her son, William's grandfather. And the grandfather treasured it and refused to ever let it be used. And William and his daughter now have respected those wishes. And the quilt has never been used, which is why it's 120 years old and it's still in its original condition. So she used an ordinary common pattern, but the quilt itself is a symbol of the family story, one of a hard journey while the mother was dying of cancer to resettle west of New York so that she could die and be buried near her family. Oh, it's going to be fickle. I don't know if we should switch over. Beth, I don't know if you have the have it queued up or not. I will continue to tell the story though. The next quilt was made by Pearl Spotted Tail from Parmalee, South Dakota. And I'm going to ask Beth to maybe cue it up and let me know when you're ready, and then I can stop sharing and Beth can share. The next quilt that I hope you're about to see might not be immediately identified as a health quilt either. Spotted Tail, who is a Sioux quilt maker, makes what she calls broken star quilts when someone she loves dies or when she wants to comfort others who are sad. And she explains that when her mother died, she said, I made a broken star and I put it on top of her casket because I had a broken heart. And Spotted Tail also burns a small bit of sage and says a prayer for peace and health before she begins to piece any of her quilts. And
I think you're going to have to stop your screen sharing so Beth can share hers.
Our apologies. We practiced this in advance and it was working just fine. And I've lost Beth altogether here. So I hope she's queuing up. The point here is that the quilts don't always, you can't tell just by looking at them if they are health related or not. And with Spotted Tail's quilts, the broken star that you will eventually see represents a broken heart. And she, as she's piecing these quilts, she thinks of all of her ancestors who have gone before her. And she says her ancestors give her inspiration to keep on quilting. So there we go. That's great. Thank you, Beth.
Get the
Perfect. Wonderful. Can everybody see that? Okay. There we go. There's the Broken Star by Pearl Spotted Tail. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, the relationship to health becomes just a little more obvious. And this one was made by Vimala McClure from Willow Springs, Missouri, and it's titled Phoenix. And after a concussion suffered in a fall in her studio, McClure began suffering from a variety of debilitating health conditions, including chronic severe pain. And she went through multiple treatments before she was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and it was complicated by depression, which it usually is. And she eventually had to give up her work running a small publishing company, but she continued to make quilts as a means to express her experience living with illness. And in her own words, she said, Phoenix is a journey from being well, the first experience of the chronic pain, finding the courage to continue, coming through it and being completely changed by it. The left side of the quilt, as you can see here, represents my life before fibromyalgia. It's my happy, quiet, pretty life. The black figure represents the fibromyalgia hitting me. The spiky shape is the pain, and the fireball shows the feeling of fire searing through me. The middle of the quilt, overdyed in grays, represents the period when I was depressed and I couldn't function. My life felt like a morass of smoke and ashes. And actually it's reversed. So on the left side, you will see the quilt represents my rising from the ashes. I used the traditional birds in flight block with flying geese, representing the energy of flying again. So the large black lightning bolt is transformed into the birds in flight. And then on the right side, you will also see the use of bright color fabrics with black within them. And this is representing how I integrated fibromyalgia into my life, and that in many ways, it made my life much richer. Slide, please. This is also a quilt made to cope with a specific medical condition. And maybe you can guess what the condition is, but the quilt is called Eye of Panic. And it was made by Linda Elkin of Sag Harbor, New York. And in her words, it celebrates my personal healing from panic disorder, an illness that for many years haunted and often debilitated me. I made it because I wanted to use the fabric that I had created during several panic attacks. The lighter colored squares in the piece were done with fabric crayons put directly onto fabric during a long, very intense panic attack. And I felt really good about cutting up the panic fabric like I was in charge rather than the panic being in charge. The border squares are comprised of alternating pieces of fabric. Its geometry is repetitive and soothing, which is the antithesis of panic. The borders, I feel like the quilt symbolizes my conquering of the disorder. I still do get the attacks, but they're fewer and far between. And in creating Eye of Panic, I have symbolically cut panic down to size. I've contained and restrained it. I have stitched it shut. And I have looked at panic unafraid and made it retreat. Slide, please. This quilt is titled The Beat Goes On. It was made by Ricky Timms of Colorado. He's a full-time professional quilt artist who had triple heart bypass surgery at the age of 44. And he said, on day 8, after my surgery, I was going stir crazy and decided I had to sew something, anything. I went to my studio and I drew this design, and this simple heart shape commemorates this major event in my life. And the title comes from the song made famous by Sonny and Cher. Slide, please. There are a number of quilts that depict what is happening medically and physically inside the body, even down to the cellular level, as the artist's way to understand what is happening to them. And this one, called C3 Infiltration, was made by Ruth White from Ithaca, New York, who is a molecular biologist and who works at the Boyce Thompson Institute of Cornell. And when she learned that she had advanced appendix cancer in 2009, she said the scientific part of my brain kicked in and I became curious. She turned to quilting to make sense of her illness, and she created a whole series of art quilts that she calls the Cancer series. And this one here depicts black and gray, those black and gray cancer cells squeezing between the normal cells and infiltrating another organ. And in her words, making art and sewing lets me work out some of my fears and worries about the cancer. It helps me to make something beautiful out of something ugly. Slide, please. This is a great example of a quilt that is clearly health related. And it was made by Linda Huff of Algonquin, Illinois, and it's named after her grandmother, Nevelyn. And it depicts the impact of Alzheimer's disease on an individual, and you get a very visual representation of Nevelyn's life fading from very bright, vibrant in the upper left corner to fading away to almost non-existent in the lower right corner. And Huff, like many quilt artists, designed this quilt as a way to memorialize her grandmother, to remember different characteristics of her grandmother's life through a very intentional textile design and choice of materials used. And in her words, she says, in 1999, Grandpa died, and then Grandma was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. The woman who sits in the nursing home today has no memory of friends or family or the special things that she and her husband did, especially for this time in her life. She was once lively and vibrant, and in the end, only a ghost of her former self remains. There are 868 small squares in this border. They speak of so many things in my grandmother's life, the fabric that she worked with to make clothes and quilts, and her attention to small details, and her desire that things needed to be done the right way, and her love of color. And they also symbolize all of her memories and funny stories and sad times and trips she took and the things she has done. All the little pieces of her life are now lost to her forever, but they're memorialized in this quilt. And just a side caveat, I'm a gerontologist and I am in a medical school. I teach medical students. And I could stand up all day and lecture about Alzheimer's disease and everybody's eyes would glaze over. But I show this quilt and instantly people get it. They get it. And we showed this quilt at a conference in Detroit once. And I noticed this young woman standing in front of it, quiet, with a tear coming down her cheek. And she later said that her grandmother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she knew exactly what that quilt meant. Slide, please. This quilt here is titled Charlie Wood's Stoma quilt, and it was made by his daughter, Margaret Wood. And it was made 2 years after his passing from throat cancer, and every design choice has meaning in it. As you can see, it's three-dimensional. In this center is an actual plastic mesh radiation mask that he wore for 6 weeks of radiation treatment. And in Margaret's words, the X's on the quilt represent the X's marked by radiologists on her father's mask to pinpoint where radiation treatment was to be directed. She put in Seminole patchwork because my father is Seminole, and blue colors because that's his favorite color. The red and white borders represent the cigarettes that caused the cancer. The appliqued tracings of hands symbolize some of the people, especially family, that helped him on his healing journey. The lighter hands at the top represent Margaret's husband, who is white. Slide, please. This is a special image to us. Katie Hansen there on the left was our invaluable research assistant. Her husband, Eric, is on the right. They had a daughter, Laurel, who we all knew, who was developmentally disabled and required 24/7 support. And she died a couple of years earlier. The woman in the middle of this photo is Brianna Bush, Laura's primary direct care worker. And we were long into this book project when Katie said, I think I have a quilt that could be in the book. And up until that moment, she hadn't mentioned it. And she hadn't met Brianna in the middle there is the one who made this quilt, and it's titled Laurels Quilt, and it's made out of Laurel's clothes. And I guess in all the time we had been working on the book, it was just too painful to Katie to say anything about it. It was too close to home. But she did share her story, and in her words, she said, when our special needs daughter Laurel died at age 25, one of her caregivers made a quilt for us out of her clothing. It includes Laurel's favorite shirts, pajamas, jeans, and more. Each piece has a different history and it holds powerful memories for us. It represents cherished moments, events, or feelings. We bring this quilt to our grief therapy sessions and lay it over our laps. The textures and colors and memories bring Laurel's spirit close to us in a way that's hard to explain. We sleep under it, the sensation of Laurel's presence comforting us through the night. Slide, please. This quilt is the image on our book cover. It's called HIV Positive, Reaching for a Cure. It was made by Marion Coleman of Castro Valley, California. And Marion's work often focuses on issues of human rights, particularly of African Americans. But she has also made several quilts that pay tribute to the legacies of other people of color. She made this one in tribute to Nelson Mandela for his advocacy for research to cure the HIV virus. And if you look closely, there are words stitched in throughout all references to HIV. I'd like to show just a few images of quilts now made individually or with others that are part of larger collective effort with collective meaning. Slide, please. Thousands of quilt makers have joined with others to make what is broadly termed charity or service quilts to provide material and emotional comfort to those in need, and to raise awareness about or funds for causes, including those related to health and well-being. I have some great quotes here, but I'm going to jump down and just explain this quilt because it's one that I think we can all identify with. It's called Women Helping Others. It was made by Jennifer Day of New Mexico. The women pictured are members of the Legion of Loyal Ladies who have come together to make hospital bedding for people who were afflicted by the 1918 flu pandemic. And on March 4th, 1918, a company cook reported sick at Fort Riley, Kansas. And by noon on March 11th, and take note of that date, March 11, over 100 soldiers were in the hospital, and within 10 days, 522 men at the camp had died. March 18th, the virus had reached Queens, New York, and the world was soon in the grips of the 1918 pandemic. The artist, her own grandmother, fell sick in 1918. She survived. She died at the age of 96. And the pictures at the bottom of the quilt are men in recovery at Walter Reed Hospital. Slide, please. Perhaps the most well-known public display and health-related quilt project is the NAMES Project Foundation's AIDS Memorial Quilt that is intended to foster healing. It consists of over 48,000 panels sewn into blocks of 8 panels. And when it spread on the ground, it forms a quilt that is 1.2 million square feet. This is on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It weighs more than 50 tons. Every panel is made sometimes by just one person or by a group of individuals. Every panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, which is the approximate size of a grave. And it represents at least one person, sometimes many, who have died of AIDS. Next slide, please. This slide, I think, is meant to underscore the magnitude of charity or mission quilts. These are from just one organization, the Lutheran World Relief Organization, and this is their donations from 1 year. They do this every year. Every year, quilt makers across the U.S. donate an average of 400,000 mission quilts to the Lutheran World Relief to be distributed to overseas partners. In 2013, nearly 500,000 quilts were donated to this campaign and sent to partner organizations around the world which had requested them. And there still was not enough to meet the number of requests. Slide, please. I just have a few more and I'm going to skip through them really fast. This one I like because we were able to meet the person who started this. It depicts a group of quilt makers and volunteers associated with the Alzheimer's Art Quilt initiative, AAQI, which was established by a quilt artist, Ami Sims, in Flint, Michigan, who was inspired to start it because her mother had Alzheimer's and she wanted to find a way to raise awareness of Alzheimer's and also raise money for research. And she came up with a clever idea. She asked people all over the world to make a quilt block the size of a UPS envelope and send it to her, and she would auction it off. And when all was said and done, she had auctioned enough to she raised over $1 million to support basic science Alzheimer's disease research. Slide, please. There are a number of quilts proliferation of projects intended to comfort those who are serving in the military or have suffered war-related injuries. Some of the most well-known ones are Quilts of Valor project with a mission to cover service members and veterans touched by war with comforting and healing quilts of valor. There have been over 135,000 of these quilts made. Slide, please. This is another form of mission quilts or charity quilts. It's, and again, there's a proliferation of quilting projects in men and women's prisons, as well as juvenile detention centers. And they're framed as a way in which prisoners can make quilts as therapy, but also for restorative justice, in which they have an opportunity to engage in something meaningful that helps other people and gives something back to society. A sense of purpose and a feeling of being connected to something bigger than themselves. Slide, please. This is Kay Needles, a NICU nurse, sewing volunteer coordinator at St. David's. I'll just quickly say that she's organized a massive campaign to make these quilts to cover isolettes, which are incubators, temperature controlled, humidity, oxygen levels, armholes, all controlled, through which a premature baby can be touched and cared for. They're typically covered to keep the baby in a dark environment, which approximates the conditions of the womb. And these handmade covers are intended to reduce the sterile look of the isolette and thereby the trauma. And before I move on, I'll just say that they're all made out of scrubs that nurses have donated. And she says most of us hang on to our scrubs. They're not something that we give away. And now they get to know that, and it's for the parents to help reduce the trauma. So the parents get to know which isolette holds their baby by looking at the quilts. Slide, please. This quilt is called Giving Comfort to Children. It was made by a member of the Riverwalk Quilt Guild of Naperville. They have made hundreds of these now. And these are to help they were visiting the hospital's pediatric sexual abuse center. They toured it, they were horrified. These rooms are typically very, very sterile. There's a metal bed and every piece of equipment needed to do a gynecological exam. And so they came up with this idea. They now make these quilts and pillow covers. And when a child comes in that needs to be examined for potential sexual abuse, they are greeted with this. They get to keep the quilts and the pillowcase and take the bear home as well. And there's story after story of how it's comforted these children. Next slide.
Claire, we're running out of time.
Yeah, this, I'll just quickly go to the end here. This is a new tradition covering the bodies of veterans who have died in the hospital or nursing home as they are wheeled out while the staff salutes. Next slide. These are called fidget quilts. They're made for people typically with dementia or Alzheimer's disease to help calm them down. There's a lot of 3D stuff on there that they can fiddle with, like zippers that open and close. And they are, there's been a lot of research on these already to produce evidence that they actually work. And then the final slide is a photo of sisters Joyce, Lynn, and Joanne Betts, who in 2015 decided to start making what they said was a few quilts. They bought machines, started sewing, and 2,000 quilts later, these women are, at the time this picture was taken, they were both in their late 80s, and they have, they now produce just a massive number of quilts, just the two of them, and they're all donated to hospitals and children's organizations.
Yeah, I'll just say that Claire and I have written now about the many quilt makers who are in the old population who are making quilts, hundreds.
Yeah, who started when they were older. So I hope this has given you an idea of all of the ways in which quilt can be health related for therapy, public education, fundraising, and more. And I'm going to turn it back to Marsha who can wrap up this part of the session and then turn it over to Beth for a demo. So thank you for your time and attention.
So I started with the personal story, and I'm going to come back to another personal story before I give it to Beth. And that is that in because it's illustrative also of another way of thinking about quilts and healing. So when our mother in 2012 was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it was only 2 weeks later she was transferred to a hospital and into a hospice room. There, surrounded by her husband, our father, children, and close family, she was covered in 2 family quilts. One made by her maternal grandmother as a present for her wedding, and the other pieced by her great-grandmother, quilted by her grandmother, and bound by her mother. So in her final couple of hours, these precious textiles must have surely and silently it's hard for me to say this, silently gave her both physical warmth and spiritual comfort. Those who stood around her felt the presence through those textiles of those who went before her. With that, I'm going to turn it now to Beth. Beth, are you ready to
Sure.
pick up? Great.
So what you're looking at right now is the Quilt Index, and I'm going to really race through this because this is really already the start of our Q&A time. So the first thing you're going to be hit with is our donation page, which we really hope that you'll use. But there are a lot of ways to find Quilts and Health in the Quilt Index. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to our collections section.
Hey, Beth, I want to interject
And-
here and just say you're still sharing the presentation and not your Quilt Index screen. So,
Really?
yeah.
So is that better?
Let's see, I think you stopped your share, so now I think you can reshare your internet browser.
Okay. So share screen.
Mhm.
There. Now are we right?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So you missed our opening screen, which has our donation page. But anyway, what I did was I went to collections up here, and I'm at documentation projects. I'm going to look for Quilts and Health, and I'm going to go to the sort by, and I'm going to go name Z to A because Q is at the other end of the alphabet, and that'll bring up my Quilts and Health project a little bit faster. So if I scroll down, there's the quilt we just looked at in Evelyn, and we're going to view the collection. And when we get to that page, we're going to find a lot of interesting information about the project and how we documented quilts. You're going to find a place where you can print out a form if you want to submit a quilt for the Quilts and Health project. Link to our blog and our Facebook page, and then a little bit about how we went about doing our research. And then we're going to see view all records in this project. When I click on that, what's going to happen is it's going to show all of the quilts that are in the Quilts and Health project, plus any quilts that I found in other projects that are related to health. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is all of these links below. And what those are is those are links to stories about quilts. They're links to a special collection of mask making that we did, collected stories, and also ephemera, newspaper articles, and AQSG uncovering papers that have to do with health as well. So let's look at the quilts. So we'll go back to view all records in this project. And we see 188 quilts so far. So we don't see them all at once, so we're going to hit load more and see more of them. Some of them you're going to recognize because they were in the PowerPoint that we just saw.
And all of the images that are in our Quilts and Health book, we got permission to add them to the Quilt Index.
And then if you want to refine what you're looking at a little bit more, you can use the compare feature. Also, there's a sort feature. So right now the default is sorting by the title of the quilt, but you can also sort by the maker, and you can sort by the date when they were made. But let's say you're curious to look at some of these quilts side by side, you can press the little circle. And then you can go to compare. And that will bring up the quilts that you just clicked on. And then you can move them around and change the order of them. So that's kind of a neat little tool. When you're all done, you can hit clear selected quilts and it will start fresh. However, you can leave those in there, and when you're goofing around in the Quilt Index and other places, you can add quilts to your selected quilts. So I'm going to go to stories right now. because that's another place that you can find information about quilts and health. When the Quilt Index was redone a couple of years ago, it was redone because the coding had been old and it had decayed. Why that is, I don't know. I'm not a programmer. But when we had to rewrite the whole site, then what we did was we made the site relational so that things will hook up together. The reason being is I want you to be able to stumble on things when you're in the Quilt Index that may lead you to something else that's interesting. So here's the story section, and these are featured stories. Then they have new stories, which are stories that just got added. And then we have all stories. And I just clicked on all so you can see how many stories are in there right now. And one of the things when COVID started, a lot of us made masks and we really wanted to capture that information. So we asked people to send in their stories about their mask making. So there's a whole bunch of those. And if you scroll down, you can see that this is part of the Quilts and Health. And so this will bring us back to the Quilts and Health documentation page if we want to go there. Now, the mask stories, they don't really belong with quilts, but they are something that a lot of quilt makers did. And I also wanted to be able to isolate just those mask stories. So if we go back to collections, there's a special collections page just about mask making. And there it is. Quilters respond, and I don't know why there's two of them. I'll have to look at that after we get done here. But you can go ahead from this. Let's see. That looks like the one that's not good. So we could go to view all records and we can see all the stories that we received about mask making. And I want to go back to the page I was just on, and I want to show you a little quirk that I haven't quite solved yet in the Quilt Index. If I go back to search, it's not going to bring me back to the previous page I was at. So I'm going to use the back page in my browser as opposed to the one in the Quilt Index. And that's going to give me, that's more intuitive way to go back to what you were looking at. But if you click here, then you can actually submit your own mask making story. And it's an online portal where you can add your story. And it's not just masks, but if you made headbands or anything else that was related to COVID and sewing, you can enter that here. Now, the other thing I want to do is show you the search feature. So if I go to search, right now it's searching quilts, but I can also search stories. I can search artists, collections, resources, and ephemera. And so if I put the word health in, it's going to bring up all the quilts, not necessarily health related, but where the word health is somewhere in the data that was collected. So now we're seeing 429 records, which is more than I have in the Quilts and Health portal. So one day I'll be going through all of these to see which ones are really health related and which ones are just, they might say, oh, you're having good health or something like that. So the other thing I want to look at is searching ephemera. And ephemera is newspaper clippings, journal articles, anything paper related that has to do with quilting that's in the Quilt Index. So if I search there, I'm going to come up with articles and I'm going to come up with AQSG There's an AQSG article. These are from the Detroit News from the 1930s. Now imagine if you start searching by words like cancer or disease or anything else that's health related, then you're going to see a lot more going on as well. So I am going to stop there and be ready for questions and answers.
We have questions. First, I just want to say thank you so much for this presentation. I was following along in the chat, and I'm sure you were as well as presenters. And you know, there's so many tears of people. I know I got teary just listening, and this is definitely a heartfelt presentation, and one that really touches all of us because we all are in varying stages of health. So the first question I wanted to ask, I know Claire mentioned this briefly at the end, but Karen asks that she says that she has heard of a nursing home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania that has a designated quilt that is used to drape the gurney as the medical staff take the deceased person out of the nursing home. And I know Claire touched on that a little bit at, I think, the VA hospital in Cheyenne. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about gurney quilts, and I think they're called dignity quilts.
Mhm.
So if you can talk about that a little bit more, that'd be lovely.
Sure. Yeah, I wish I'd had more time to tell. We have so many stories around that. We have a story from an hour from here, Grand Rapids, Michigan, where we visited a nursing home, and there are staff members there that coordinate the making of dignity quilts or gurney quilts. And they, as their story goes, they said a resident in the nursing home approached them because she was upset that when somebody died, they were always taken out the back door. And with no fanfare, no chance to say goodbye, no honoring of their life. And so the staff actually listened and changed the policy so that when people died, they would then take them out the front door on the gurney. And they started draping, you know, a colorful blanket over the gurney, over the person. And then they started making quilts to give to them in advance if they were dying, and then put over the gurney, and then give to the family afterwards as a remembrance.
And some residents were even making their own quilt for that eventual purpose.
Right, and that gave them the opportunity to pick out the color, their favorite color, to pick up fabrics they really liked, and so they would make one in anticipation of their own death. So it is happening all over the United States, probably the world, but it is something that's happening, a phenomena that's pretty touching.
Oh, just hearing you talk about it just makes me a little bit teary.
I still read the book and get all teared up. Every story is moving.
I just want to mention before this is over that this is the contact page for the Quilt Index. So if you've got any questions that didn't get answered, go to About and go to Contact. It'll bring you up to this page and it comes directly to me.
Perfect.
So
And Beth,
help
do you mind,
yourselves.
in a few minutes here, do you mind stopping your screen share? Because I know we'll need to thank our sponsors as well. Let's see.
And I'm just putting that information about the Quilts and Health book too, just
Perfect.
so people can have those.
Perfect. Now in the book, so I have a question from Emily asking about how Eye of Panic was constructed. Do you also talk about some of the ways the quilts are constructed if it's more of an art quilt in your book? Or can you speak to how that quilt in particular was constructed?
Quilt is individual panels, and they're linked together with chain. And so it's a whole group of quilts that are sort of all hooked together. And in the Quilt Index, all of those quilts are in there, and it's described how they're made. And there's also descriptions of how they're made in the book in the object label.
Oh, that's wonderful. So
and we did not make a distinction between what are very traditional quilts or what are studio art quilts.
Right.
They're quilts.
Exactly.
For us, it was the connection to health and well-being.
Yes, I think that that's really important. And one person brought up the idea that pregnancy, being in the stage of pregnancy also prompts a lot of quilts, which is another, there's so many facets around quilts and health that they just seem so intertwined. It's amazing.
Yeah, may I just make a comment on that? Because not all of the health-related quilts are associated with something bad, a bad medical condition. A lot of them are associated with joyful occasions related to health, like pregnancy. And some of them are made as preventative, to make sure that, as a way to meditate and stay calm and to keep your mental health high and good. So they're associated with good health as well.
Yes, and we did get a question about that as well. I'm sure there are many quilts in the Quilt Index and as part of this project that talk about making the process of making the quilt as being good or beneficial to the maker's health, to their own mental and probably physical well-being as they're making this. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that, about quilts as their own treatment, I guess. I'm not sure of the correct word to use. Yeah.
In fact, in the Quilt Index form, it asks, why do you make quilts? And one of them is therapy. It is very therapeutic to do quilt making. And I think that's a reason why a lot of people make them to donate. So not only are there people receiving them because they may be suffering from something, but there's a lot of people that are lovingly making and giving them. And the big thing about the Quilt Index too is that if you don't put that in the form, when you submit a quilt, then we're never going to find that out on the other end. But what I found interesting is how many times Quilts and Health came up in the Detroit News in the 1930s. And there were a lot of women who were in sanitariums, and they would ask people through this Detroit News column to donate fabric to them, send them scraps of fabric so that they would have something to do while they were recovering from TB. And a lot of them then also talked about how good it made them feel to make quilts. So
I'm looking at the chat function too, and it's because I was going to say something about how it helps with bereavement and working through grief. And I noticed somebody saying that you made a quilt out of your husband's shirts and ties when he died. It's a bereavement quilt. And we had so many examples of that, including the one that I showed with Katie Hansen made out of Laurels clothing, and how much it helped them through their whole process of grief.
And I have to say that Claire and I don't quilt. Yeah.
Well, Marsha made one once.
I made one, but Beth does quilt, and I know, she's told me many a time, that, it's for her. Beth, you should say this in your own words, how you feel.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't make a lot of, you can't tell visually by looking at the quilt. I'm a very traditional quilt maker, but there's been many times in my life where quilting has been a great distraction from other issues. And it's just a joy to be able to do it. And it's in the making, not necessarily in the product, that I enjoy so much the process.
I think it's that way for so many people. I think that's true to a lot of quilters, that the process is as important or sometimes more important as the finished product. And I think that that's true. That's why there are so many people who make so many quilts to donate. Like you said, the process for them of making the quilt, they don't even need to keep it, but just being part of the process is so beneficial to them. So I also wanted to, I know we're running a little bit over on time, but so for the final question, I wanted to ask a little bit more about the fidget quilts. We've gotten a few questions about, how to get a little bit more information on fidget quilts. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, they seem to be a newer thing.
That's a Beth and Claire question to answer.
I'll just, Beth can talk about the construction of it and all of that. I'll just say, you know, I had a previous life, 20 years in nursing homes, working as a geriatric social worker. And, you know, there's so many times when a resident with dementia or Alzheimer's disease is fidgeting and it's really hard to calm them down. But these are, I think you're right, Brenna, these are fairly new. They're about the size of a lap blanket. They're often 3D. The artist creates them using lots of different kinds of textures, you know, different kinds of material with different textures. And then sews things on them like buttons. So it's similar to like a worry stone maybe, where you can just sit and rub it. But then also things that are interactive. I think I mentioned that, you know, we've seen them with zippers on them so that you can zip and unzip and zip and unzip. And then you can also make them, individualize them so that they maybe are relevant to whoever, whatever that person's career was. And we, for example, we heard of one that was made for an accountant that had like a dollar bill on it that he could open up and put, fold back up and open up and fold back up. And the evidence is showing that these actually work. They do calm people down. So Beth, do you want to add anything to that?
She's made them.
Oh yeah, you've
I'm
made
just
them,
gonna
right?
Yeah, and I'm going to share the screen so you can see them. So I've made this one, this one, this one, and this one. And I'd like to say they were fun to make, but they weren't. However, this right here was my favorite because that's actually a maze with marbles in it. So you can move the marbles all around. But, you know, when you open them up,
there's the channel of the quilting.
Yeah. And so when you open, you know, you can open things up and there's little surprises inside. There's buttons, there's buckles that move back and forth. And I always had to have them quilted as well as just have stuff on them. And I think that's why they were a little bit trickier for me to make than they needed to be. But that's kind of what I do anyway, is if it's really hard, that's what I like to do in quilting. So, and then I have to remind myself, yeah, you wanted it to be this hard. So, but anyway, the actual quilts are more like the size of a placemat, the ones that I made.
Okay. Okay. So nice and small, easy to keep on your lap to fidget as needed.
And it's really fun to go to Joann Fabrics and buy the stuff to put on it.
I mean, shopping therapy is always good therapy in my book.
Right.
So I wish we could talk for so much longer because this is really such an amazing topic. And I'm glad that we had some time to look at the Quilt Index so that you guys could not see me tearing up and we had a moment to collect ourselves. But also because the Quilt Index is such a great resource. And I think many people who saw today's lecture and have not seen your Quilt Index lecture, I really encourage you guys to go back and check that out because you have many hours of fun looking through the Quilt Index ahead of you. So if you haven't checked out that presentation, please go back and take a peek and, you know, have fun exploring with the Quilt Index because I think it's really such a great resource. Beth?
And I would just like to figure out a way that we can get more modern quilts in the Quilt Index, because a lot of the documentation projects, you know, cut themselves off like at 1950, but we really want to see the modern quilt movement is so big and so important, and it's not well represented. So we invite more discussion on how we can do that. So just call me.
Thank you so much, Beth. Well, I'm going to have, it has just been such a joy to spend time with you three this afternoon. So thank you so much for being here. And Lucy, if you don't mind putting on our sponsors, thank you. So we really could not make Textile Talks happen without the support of our sponsors. So we are able to keep them free to everyone because of these sponsors. So we want to say thank you to Moda Fabrics and Supplies, to eQuilter, to Shipper Publishing, and to Misty Fuse. And another slide. And we also have Quilt Show, C&T Publishing, Artistic Artifacts, Empty Spools, Aurifil, 9 Patch Fabrics, Quilt Mania, and Handy Quilters. So please support them and support our fiber art organizations who are making these textile talks possible, and make sure you spend some time on the Quilt Index. So thank you all so much for being here. It's been such a pleasure. And I hope that you all continue on. I think every one of us is on a quilt and health journey. So I encourage everybody to continue on your health and quilting journey. So thank you all so much for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.